Please welcome our next dynamic duo, Nigel and James Cox. Today they will be presenting their session, Keep It Simple, Manufacturing and Warehousing. Please stick around after Nigel and James' session for a live Q&A.
Welcome everybody to the DynamicsCon virtual session called Keep It Simple, Manufacturing and Warehousing. My name is Nigel Cox. I am the Vice President of Microsoft Manufacturing Solutions at Invista. Very happy to have you all here today for this DynamicsCon event. Hopefully I'll be meeting some of you at the live DynamicsCon later this year. As we present what we're going to present, please remember to put all your questions in chat, and we will be dealing with those at the end of the presentation. With me, who you'll be seeing shortly, is James Cox, Senior Pre-Sales Solution Architect at Invista. I will be handling the how we keep manufacturing simple. He will be handling how we keep warehousing simple. We will not be addressing lean manufacturing today. We only have about 40 minutes, and that's one of the things we decided to sacrifice. If any of you are interested, catch me at the live event. I'm very happy to have a conversation with you. So a couple of disclaimers. When you're trying to keep things simple, think of your ERP system as a model of your business. But our goal is not to make that model more real. Our goal is to actually dumb it down, and so that it's optimal for what we're trying to get out of it. So if you're asking yourself, should we try and model this because it'd be more realistic? Ask yourself, is that going to help me make good, productive decisions? And if not, then eliminate that complexity. Next thing I want to say is that everything doesn't have to be in the ERP system. You want the right tool for the right job. I'll be mentioning later, for example, two-bin inventory management, where you literally are not dealing with that particular item in master planning at all, just by way of example. And let me also say that when we say simpler, we're really trading off power and flexibility for simplicity. So sometimes, we want that power, we want that flexibility, and we have to have a more complex setup and a more complex solution. So it's a trade-off. Do we want the setup to be simple, or do we want the user experience to be simple? And sometimes they are in conflict. My next point is that, when you're going through implementing the system or going through a new phase, it really deserves some time, investment during that to make it simpler when you actually go live with that new capability. So simpler doesn't necessarily mean less thought. And also, this is a really important point. Sometimes when you make it simple for one user, you're actually making it more complicated for another. Dynamics is a fully integrated system, and we have to keep that in mind. So what are some of the things that we can do to keep manufacturing simple? First one on the list is expense consumables. When you have every nut and bolt on the bill of materials, are you really benefiting from that? And especially when those nuts and bolts are pervasive, that can seriously slow, not to make it more complicated, that can seriously slow down master planning. So this is a good example of where using two-bin approach, basically, one bin, you tear a label off, send it to purchasing. You get to the last bin, tear a label off, it's an expedite to purchasing or manufacturing. Next, consider backflushing the bond lines, so you don't have to design all the pick process and how the human beings are going to transact. If you trust your bills of material, then it can make life a lot simpler if when you finish an operation or when you finish the order, you just backflush what the bill of materials thought you should be using. Another way is just ignore scrap and yield. Many clients of mine don't try and account for scrap and yield, and they just live with the challenges that presents without having to model it in the system. Ignore interaction with the route operation. So let's say you've got a 5-step route operation and you need some materials at the beginning and you need some materials on operation 30, then possibly just ignore that route operation on the bill of materials line. It will always go to the first operation if you just ignore it. If you're in the process industry, sometimes life can be simpler if you do your formula as percentages instead of quantities, which the system allows you to do. In both worlds, consider using phantoms and consider using peg supply. With phantoms, basically you're going to explode the phantom item in your bill of materials out to all of its components at the time that production order or batch order goes from created to estimated. If you're treating it from planning, it goes immediately to scheduled and immediately explodes through the phantoms. So you can have one phantom part number that's, let's say, 20 components, and now you've got that one phantom on 100 parents. If you have an engineering change, you've just got to change the one phantom instead of 100 parents. So that can keep life a lot simpler. Peg supply basically means that as you create and estimate the parent order, it automatically creates the child order. In a make-to-order world, this can be very useful. And it goes all the way down. So if you've got 3 levels of bill of material, you build a machine, and you do peg supply, boom, you can create all the production orders needed for 3 levels of the bill of material at once. How about labor and machine? Well, one option is we don't even bother with routings. And it's not so common now, but it used to be quite a popular approach. Obviously, you lose a lot of power and flexibility by doing this. But you leave all of that to the real world, to the execution. And you don't bother with modeling it on the system. It's feasible. Some people, I'm not a big fan of it, but some people will model their labor and machine basically as an item number on the bill of materials or the formula. And they'll make the cost of that item either pre-burdened or not burdened. Obviously, if it's not burdened, then your inventory value is more of a contribution cost than a full cost. Another possibility, and by the way, that makes life really difficult when you do want to do routings. Next thing we can do to keep things simple is single-step routings, right? So a single step, and maybe in the instructions or in the description, you're saying these are the different operations that have to happen in this single step. And again, that single step could be costed based on the hours or the units, and they can be pre-burdened or not burdened. If they're not burdened, again, we're contribution costing, or we'll talk about later, we may burden them in a costing sheet. Another thing to avoid if you want to keep things simple. Time entry is a biggie. You can make life much more complicated by forcing people to clock on and clock off of every little thing that they do. So if you can get away with no time entry at all and backflush your labor and machine, that really is the simplest way to go. The next level of complexity would be to basically do time entry with timesheets or with production floor execution for basically the work center only. And this is a bit of a trick. So you have an indirect code for each work center, and people don't clock onto the order, they clock on to the work center and clock off. So if they're working in the same work center all day, they're just basically clocking on and clocking off for the day. And then the final one there, the most complex, is clocking on and clocking off of every operation. And also, you don't have to do it with every resource. You may consider, I'm only going to clock on and clock on off of these critical, maybe theory of constraints, the critical work centers, and then allow all the others to be backflashed. Costing, how do we keep costing simple? Well, again, if you don't have any routings at all, that will keep costing simpler. and your contribution costing is going to be material content only. So the cost of your items would just be their material content. Not out of the question. Use production groups if you can get away with it for your costing. I've never seen anybody do it, but that obviously would be the simplest. I would recommend use cost category, because you can have way less cost categories than resources to maintain, and a bunch of resources basically can share the same cost category. Remember, on the cost category, you can be doing that either on the setup time or run time, or you can be costing based on the units produced. Avoid item overhead counting if feasible, which means you're doing contribution costing. So everything goes in, other than material content, goes into overhead. If that is not feasible, then try and avoid the costing sheet. So what you could do is on the hourly rate for the work center, you actually have an inflated hourly rate that covers both direct and indirect overhead costs. So if you are going to use the costing sheet, the simplest way is blended surcharges, i.e. percentages. So whatever cost is calculated for the direct, we apply a percentage of that to our overhead, maybe across the entire company, or maybe for certain types of work centers. So the rates would be rates per hour. That tends to get a little more complicated, and so percentages is easier. Manufacturing kept simple demand planning. Well, those of you familiar with demand planning that's in Dynamics will know that it's very handy, it's very simple, it's very straightforward, but it's rather limited. So the most complicated thing you could do is go with a third-party demand planner, but it's also the most powerful and the most flexible. I'm not even mentioning the third party here. So first option here is don't even forecast. Don't have any forecasts at all. Plenty of people do this. And what you try and do is compensate for the lack of forecasts with a higher safety stock level. So your safety stock level is not just there for unpredictability of supply and demand. It's there actually to cover the fact that your forecast is missing. Another possibility is import your forecasts, where however you come up with them. I had one client that just imported last year's sales as something to represent a forecast. Not that I'm recommending that. And some others just used an average. But you can do a fair bit in Excel, and importing forecasts is not that hard. Then, if you are using Demand Planner, how can we keep that simple? Well, one of the things I strongly recommend that if you embrace demand planning, embrace it organizationally as well. Have a dedicated demand planner, if you're big enough, a team. When you are implementing demand planner, carefully think about, do you want weekly or monthly buckets? Those are the only two choices. My preference is weekly because you get less shocks, less noise at the end of the week than you would get at the end of the month. In demand planning, one limitation, it only works with one unit of measure. So if you're lucky to be a company that does everything in pounds or everything in inches, that can be fine. If not, then I recommend just come up with a new unit of measure. I use DP, demand planning, and give it a one-to-one conversion to all the units. Use item allocations keys judiciously. You could put everything on one item allocation key. An item allocation key is just a list of items that you're forecasting. So think about those. If you put items with similar demand behavior, maybe with similar seasonality, maybe similar growth plans or decay plans, if you're phasing something out, putting them in the same allocation key can actually improve the quality of the forecast, especially if you're using ARIMA as your algorithm. Embrace actions and delays, and that might seem counterintuitive to everybody. Every time I've presented master planning, the most popular topic is actions and delays. I would argue, we don't have time here, but I'd be happy to chat with any of you at the event, the live event. You're not really taking advantage of master planning if you're not using actions and delays. What you're really doing is order launch, and you could have done that with a reorder point, right? MRP and master planning is a little better than reorder point, but you're not really getting the reactive escape path to proactive if you're not looking at actions and messages. Think of it this way. Okay, thank you. You told me to create a purchase order, and I did. But I am now going to ignore anything that changes from here on in unless somebody from sales or the shop floor calls me and tells me they've got a problem. Well, we can, using actions and delays, if the situation changes, let's say demand changes, and that purchase order that looked fine when I placed it is now in bad shape, I'll get that action message. Now, I'm hearing even before the people that are going to experience the problem, and I can get proactive. If you do this well, I tell you now, it's night and day difference. Production control suddenly becomes, and materials management suddenly becomes in command. Not for this session, though. So I am saying, if you're trying to simplify, don't take the choice of eliminate actions and delays, although that would simplify things dramatically. I also recommend leveraging ABC analysis. You don't have to run it that often, but by focusing your planning attention on the 20% of items that accounts for 80% of your cost of goods sold, you can simplify the planner's life dramatically. And this is a huge way, by the way, of trying to get on top of the action messages every day. I recommend using buyer codes for all items, not just purchased. It's only there for sorting and filtering, and it can be used just as easily for manufactured items as for purchasing. I also recommend having not just one code per person. Let's say you have a product mix change and one buyer or one scheduler is getting just overloaded with action messages. If you've got that person has like 8 different codes, you can take a couple of those codes, give them to somebody else. So a little tip there. I know that sounds a little more complicated, but it's not much, and it could make life a lot simpler for the experienced. This next bullet is consider planning at the site level. So in Dynamics, using your item coverage, your storage dimensions, you can say, I want to cover, you have to plan at least at the site level, but you can also say, actually, I want to plan at the warehouse level, in which case your safety stock levels would be suddenly at the warehouse level, and your plan will all be at the warehouse level. Since your transfer orders that you might be planning and your purchase orders are for specific warehouses, your production orders for specific warehouses, my experience has been that it's actually simpler to do things at the warehouse level. Use a safety stock journal. Again, that might seem counterintuitive. Why are we adding more complexity? But by using a safety stock journal, we can actually use the system to look at service levels and to look at safety factors on usage during lead time to actually recommend and set safety stocks. But you can also use a safety stock journal to simply set safety stocks. Instead of going to the released product and jumping over to the item coverage and keying in a value for that item, then going to another released product and going through all those clicks, you can actually do the exact same thing by opening a safety stock journal, have your list of items, go set every single safety stock level on one screen, and post it. Not only is it simpler and easier to do that, you've actually now got a history. In addition, the safety stock journal will tell you what's the financial impact of that safety stock change. How many dollars is that going to save me or cost me by changing that safety stock level? So I don't know why anybody would manage safety stocks on item coverage. I would always do it through a journal. As we mentioned before, use ABC analysis. Focusing the planning energy, focusing the cycle count energy on the 20% that are most important is a really good way of simplifying the world. If you have routings, set a capacity time fence. So if you set the capacity time fence to 0, MRP will not use the routings for its lead time calculations. It'll go look for the item coverage or the default order settings or the released product. If you set a capacity time fence, let's say your planning horizon is a year and you set your capacity time fence at 60 days, then Dynamics will use the routing for 60 days and then it will not use the routing for the rest of the time fence. That can help speed things up. But probably for simplicity, just just set the capacity time fence to the same as your planning time fence. And by the way, you will not get a capacity plan, a load plan, for anything beyond the capacity time fence. Seriously consider optimized master planning. It's kind of intriguing the way Microsoft has released optimized master planning. They haven't got all the features yet, unless I'm out of date, that were in the traditional master planning yet incorporated into optimized master planning. So many people are holding off. But it's already deprecated. And any new features that Microsoft has been developing are going into optimized master planning. They are not going into traditional. Optimize, as you know, will run a lot faster. It runs in the Azure Machine Learning Cloud, and it's an in-memory model. It runs way faster than the traditional one. So keep that in mind. Even the companies that are holding off because all the features are not quite there yet, are definitely planning to move to it. The timing of this presentation, you might want to leap right in. Capacity planning. Well, one piece of advice I give here, even with all of the improvements that Microsoft has made, don't get too obsessed with reflecting what your capacity is. In other words, Joe Smith didn't turn up for work today. Okay, I need to reduce the number of resources in my work center, in my resource group, which is the only way that you can reflect capacity, is the number of resources in a resource group, and of course their calendars. That's just too much, right? Having to go into your calendar every time a machine is going down because maybe you're not using asset management where you could do that automatically. It's too much work. And your people, your shop floor leads, they know that Joe didn't turn up today. They know that this machine is going to be down or is down. So what they really want from the system is, what's the load? How much demand have you got on my capacity? And in Dynamics, they call that a capacity plan. But really, it's not a capacity plan. It's a load plan against your capacity. My next piece of advice is only use finite capacity if you have to. I'm actually not a big believer in finite capacity for planning at all, unless you have a really good reason. But again, that's for another day. When you're looking at your resource definitions on your routings, I'm a big fan of the new resource capability rather than resource groups. And you can put resources in a resource capability just like you would have with a resource group. But now when you've got 5 machines and one machine is the only one you can use for this kind of work, and these other 2 machines, they can be used for a certain kind of work, you can do all of that with resource capabilities. You couldn't do it with resource groups. So it is more complex to set up, again, but much simpler to schedule with. I would say carefully design. Spend a bit of time before you go live or before you implement in a phase 2 or something, the way that you define your resource groups and your resource capabilities. Scheduling. The simplest form of scheduling is operation scheduling. It's to the day, it's not to the millisecond like job scheduling is. But if you do go with operation scheduling, you don't get Gantt charts. You can't really use, if I remember right, parallel routings. If you really want any kind of power, you're going to want to go with job scheduling. And the Gantt capability is so much better in 365 than it was in AX. I used to advise against doing scheduling in AX. These days, I advise in absolutely doing scheduling in AX. And here's where I would make my exception to finite. Whilst I never want to finite plan, I actually think finite scheduling on the Gantt chart is a good practice. But obviously, if you don't do it, things are simpler. My advice is leave sequencing to the shop leads. However, you do have a dispatching capability now, where a scheduler could be handling the sequencing of the dispatch list, and you could have that dispatch list literally on a big screen right next to the resource to instruct the operator, here's the next job and the next job. And that's it for manufacturing. As we mentioned before, if you've got any questions, put them in the chat, and we'll be addressing those at the end of the presentation. At this point, I would like to hand over to James Cox, who will be talking about how to keep warehousing simple.
Hello everybody, this is James Cox, Senior Pre-Sales Solution Architect with Envista. I'm going to be walking through how we can keep warehousing simple. When moving from a legacy ERP system into Dynamics F&O and looking at the WMS module, many customers can see how overwhelming the actual flexibility and functionality is in that module. It's easily one of the most complex modules within the system. And if you really want to use every feature, it can actually take a lot of time and effort to get everything set up, tested, vetted, and ready for go live. So in this presentation, I'm going to be walking through some steps about how you can actually do that in a simple manner where maybe you're taking a crawl, walk, run approach instead of just jumping right into it. One thing to consider, if you're moving from, a legacy WMS system where you have a lot of functionality that's built out, your operations is already using, all those different features, you may not be able to implement this in a fast manner and, move into, new functionality in the future. You may have to just have a longer project that actually does take a little bit of extra effort to get everything set up and working. So some things to consider, is that you can actually import a lot of details into the WMS system, right? And what's really nice is while you're going through your configuration sessions with your partner and you're actually learning what that functionality is, you can also be setting up the templates to import all that information. So instead of, hand keying in things like fixed locations or stocking limits, you can take that template, start building all those details out, and then mass import those into the system. Another thing to consider is that directed actions, they require more setup, right? So if you need the system to actually direct a user when they're doing a receipt and put away, or they're picking something for a specific customer from a specific area, those are all things that you may have to take into account, but it would take more time to set up and use. So tribal knowledge might be good enough that the team that actually is doing the movements knows where to actually take those goods when we're doing that put away process. Okay, so we'll get into that a little bit later, how we can kind of set that up. And also another thing to consider is that more validation requires more setup. So if you want users to be able to verify, the item number and the location that they're actually picking from and the license plate, etc., those things, would actually require more setup in the system and more testing to confirm that everything's done. Leveraging check digits, for instance, is a really good feature that you can actually put on your location. That's an actual, human unreadable barcode to actually validate, a little more specifically. But you may not have that set up in the warehouse today. So what that could also require is that you actually need to relabel your entire warehouse so that you actually have your original location ID as well as just check digit. That might be something you may want to consider after go live. There are some new features, though, that can actually help out setting the system up a little faster so that you don't have to go through and do a lot of things manually one by one. Microsoft has introduced in .31 two new features, which are actually just wizards. And what these wizards can do is actually streamline the setup for a lot of the base elements that need to be configured for the system. So you can see in the first one, formats, which are actually like the number sequence of your locations, location types, which are pretty self-explanatory. Those are the types of locations that actually would exist. The profiles, which are the characteristics, whether we're going to mix items, use license plates, etc. Inventory statuses, a default worker, which actually is anytime a system generated process is actually running the transaction, it'll use that ID. And then other things in the WMS system that just have to be created, like the load posting method and the wave processing methods, so that the system can actually do things like create loads, allocate inventory, etc. You can run that and set up all that base data based on the defaults that Microsoft provides, or change those. So if you don't want the default receiving location type to be called X, you can call it Y. But then the next thing is the initiation wizard, which allows a lot of the things that take a lot of time to set up, like the location directives and the work classes and the work templates, to be done in mass for you across warehouses too. So if you've had the opportunity to standardize, your naming convention of what you want the descriptions and the labels to be, you can actually set all those up in mass. Another feature that exists that can reduce the amount of time to set up is copying, right? So if you've already set up the location directives for picking and put transactions, you can actually copy those and just tweak the things that are necessary. So maybe you want to process parcel sales orders a little bit differently than LTL sales orders. You can actually just copy the first one you created, change the query at in the top of the screen that you see right there for whatever that unique value might be, but then down in the actions or the lines and with the quantities, you actually update those accordingly. That's also true for the work templates. So if you have a lot of different rules that you want to actually validate for when you're putting inventory away, maybe these kind of items can only go to these locations, and so only those certain location types are going to be valid, or so hazardous needs to go over here and non-hazardous needs to go over there. You can actually just copy those work templates, just change the ID, and then change the work class so that it's associated to only one valid location type. That's something you can consider. A new feature that was also added is that we can now copy location directives across warehouses. So if you see in the bottom left, what you weren't able to do in the past was copy, after I'd set up one warehouse and set up the locations for another one. Now you can actually do that. So that can make the setup time a lot less time and be a little bit more efficient for your team. Next thing I'm going to be walking through is the sales setup overview. So something to consider is that you're only going to use user-directed menu items for your initial go live, right? In the system, when you're picking like sales orders, you can use cluster picking. So if you want to actually process multiple work tickets at one time, you can use system-directed picking. So if you want to set up, I want the next order that's based on this criteria to appear for my user, that's something you could do. But all that requires more setup time, more testing time, and more validation time. So maybe for your initial go live, you're just creating a user-directed menu item where someone is scanning a work ID and then being told what they need to do next. And that leads us into our next point where you can actually print out the actual work report. In the future, maybe you want to move to wave labels that are generated when the wave is processed and have those sent to different printers based on scenarios. Or maybe you want to have those system-directed menu items where you're trying to move to a paperless kind of process. But for initial go live, the work report is still a pretty valid solution and gives the user everything they need to know about what they're going to be processing. Use pre-printed license plates. The system has the ability through document routing to actually generate a license plate during certain transactions. You can have set up in the system the document routing layout so it actually follows a format that you want, but maybe you don't need all that for your initial go live. Maybe you can just buy a reel of pre-printed license plates and use those. Consider releasing and processing a single order at a time. So every single order processes on its own wave, its own shipment, its own load, right? In the future, you can then move to, I want a different wave template for processing parcel orders where I'm going to process 100 orders at a time, And then you can actually change that, after you've gone live, after everything's stabilized, and move forward. Another thing that you consider is using load planning and shipment consolidation policies in the later phase, right? So maybe you're actually trying to plan out your loads for your full truckload orders and actually using the max weight and the max volume for the different types of equipment that would be leveraged, and then building out a load and releasing that to the warehouse. Maybe that's something you do in the future too. All right, next thing I'm going to be covering is the purchasing setup. So in the system, you can actually leverage a single item license plate or creating a mixed license plate. Well, mixed license plates do add a little bit of complexity, where a user is going to be instructed to build a pallet and then actually break that down while they're actually going through the put away process. That might be something that a company's not used to. So it's something that you could do in the future after you've already stabilized after go live. For the minimal directed put away, this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where tribal knowledge might be okay. So what you can do in the system is you can either, quote unquote, break the location directive so it can't find a location for the user, so that when they're actually going to do the put transaction, it shows up blank. The user would then know, based on their skill sets, this kind of item, I need to go over to this area and find a location. The other thing you could do is you can also leverage work policies. Work policies won't even create work if you've set them up for that. What you could do instead is just do an inventory movement. So one person is responsible for doing the receipts, they build out those license plates, somebody else comes by, scans the license plate, and does an inventory movement to take it and put it away. Another option here, just like we said earlier, is use pre-printed license plates. So instead of generating a license plate whenever you do the receipt, you just have a reel that someone's going to leverage, take the next one, and place that on your goods. And then another thing to consider is use fixed locations for fast-moving parts, right? So maybe what you've set up in the system that we always want to look at the fixed location first. If it's full, then they override and go to the next area. Instead of trying to build out different types of location directives where cases go here, pallets go to overstock, etc. All right. Next thing to go into is going to be the inventory setup. All right. What you can do in Dynamics F&O is you can set up different kind of cycle count plans. So I want to count my A items, my B items, my C items, all these different time periods with different kinds of classification. You can also set up cycle count thresholds. So as soon as I go below a certain quantity in a location, I now need to count it. But that's a lot of setup and a lot of testing that might need to be completed. So one thing that you can do very easily is set up a spot counting menu item and then build a business process where someone is counting an aisle every day, once a week, whatever that frequency needs to be. And now you just need to make sure that spot counting just works. Next thing you can leverage is manual replenishment. Within the system, there's multiple different types of replenishments that can be set up. You can have demand-based, so when I release orders, if in a location it does not have enough inventory, I need to actually replenish them. Then you can have min-max or zone-based replenishments. But that's a lot of things to set up and test. So what you can do is just use a manual replenishment process. Maybe you're using a Power BI report to show when certain locations are going below a certain inventory level and now we need to refill it. Or maybe your team is communicating with each other and notifying someone, hey, this location needs to be replenished. Next thing to consider is using inventory status and adjustment region codes instead of the fully built out quality management process, right? So you can set up in the system that, we want quality orders to be generated whenever I receive goods. These are the specific tests that need to be completed, but that might be too much. So the inventory status is a way to separate your inventory from something that's available and unavailable or quarantine, etc. And then your adjustment codes, which are tied back to anytime you actually count inventory out, those can be tied back to specific offset accounts. So whenever I'm actually going to take some quarantine goods and scrap it out of inventory, I can actually have an adjustment code that actually will do that process. So they'll count the inventory out and it'll hit the right GL account. All right. Next one to talk about is going to be our production setup. So a couple things that you can do is you can actually just leverage one default input location. In the system, you can define different input locations for different resources. So as they're actually moving the goods from their rack location to the production area, if you've got that set up on your resources, they can be directed to go to specific machines or people if necessary. But that might be too much. So one thing you can do is just have a default input location where everything is moved into production. Okay. Another thing you could do is order pick items, and so instead of having staging processes where we're going to take a full license plate and move it into a production area, use what we need and then move the remainder back, maybe you're able to just go ahead and just order pick the specific quantities that you actually need. Now, if you're doing things like, with pounds and drums and barrels and things like that, that might not be an option. You might still have to go through the process of staging goods because you're not actually just going to take a little bit out of that individual barrel. Another thing to consider is that you could set the bomb lines so that they're going to post with the flushing principle of available at location. So when we actually complete the work and move the goods into production, that pick list will actually be generated instead of having it, later at back flushing, or if someone wants to actually process those manually so that they're actually truing up the inventory as necessary. And again, like we said on the purchasing side, another thing you could do is have simple put-away rules, right? So leverage your team's tribal knowledge. Set up either the broken location directives or work policies so they're then able to tell the system where they're actually going to be moving the materials instead of being directed. All right. I want to thank DynamicsCon for this opportunity to share our thoughts and this presentation with your team. If you have any questions, please let us know. We'll actually get into those right now. Thank you very much.